Children as political capital, unchilding and the incomplete death. All this gnawing at the existence of the colonized tends to make of life something resembling an incomplete death. Fanon. Swimming with Bones and the Art of Living. As a member of Mada al-Kamel, a Palestinian research center in Haifa, I joined a group of researchers with my daughter on a tour of Jaffa to learn about its history, politics, and the present situation. Sami, a young historian and PhD student who was born and raised in Jaffa, led the tour. Pointing to the historical port, Sami told us, as children, we loved swimming together in the sea, but we also used to find human bones. These were the bones of our family members, Palestinians, the bones of the bodies that were thrown into the sea when Israel demolished our graveyard and destroyed the city. Sami was referring to the years following the 1948 Nakba. This city was an economic, social, and cultural center before the establishment of the Israeli state. Unquote. When you hear such words spoken as a matter of course on a beautiful afternoon, it is impossible not to take pause, to have them resonate later. How can we assimilate and assess the historical and political contexts and legacies that leave children to swim with the dead bones of their comrades and ancestors? This book has been formulating in my mind for some time, and I wondered, is this the mute confirmation of the impact of what I had been thinking of as unchilding, my shorthand at the time for those displaced from humanity and childhood? The apparent injustice of the bones of the dead and the endless erasures and dispossessions of Palestinian spaces that they represent are reminders of the wounding that coexists with the continuing resistance to subjugation. The revolt of the Children of the Stones against such unchilding during the Intifada of the late 1980s is but one example. M. Siraj Said defined those children as perhaps the single most important factor in sustaining the Palestinian resistance of the Israeli occupation of their lands. In this book, the perspectives of the children present evidence and provide witness for what Said identifies that while Palestinian children are a specific and designated target of settler colonialism, they are also a singular and particular form and source of resistance. Sami's words above provide testimony for the fact that any conceptualization of Palestinian childhood today is necessarily mired in historical and contemporary racialized politics. The narratives from the children shared in this book acutely demonstrate that their observations are shaped by local matrices of power and global transnational geopolitics. I am not suggesting that their discourse claims formal recognition of such narratives, but, more importantly, they speak with the poignant honesty of children. And this unconstrained and unambiguous witness speaks to the continuing dispossession of Palestinians. As I have repeatedly pointed out in this volume, dispossession is a loaded word in the context of the issues we have been discussing. This is a denial and deprivation that aims to take more than Palestinian land. Dispossession becomes the usurpation of the very foundational rights of children to live a life without violence. I call this process of dispossession unchilding, and throughout this book I have attempted to reveal the operational ideologies that underlie it. Unchilding, as I have asserted, is the authorized eviction of children from childhood, geopolitically, psychologically, and historically understood as targeting children. It is conceptualized spatiotemporally when their spaces are active actors in the operationalization of unchilding. Unchilding, as the removal of the native child from land, is designated to create, direct, transform, and construct children as dangerous, non-childlike others. Unchilding is an ideological and practical cornerstone that operates through the penetration of the intimate and simultaneously the penetration of the body politic and the lives and deaths of the colonized. It governs the children of the natives, their bodies, lands, and survival. Race, securitization, and colonialism, central to the constitution of the sacred settler and the profane terrorist other, are the regimes through which children's unchilding functions to mark the dispensability and disposability of the Palestinian child. Unchilding is both created and reinforced by an operational system whereby Palestinian children are always already nobodies, but at the same time they are constructed as dangerous, backward, and in constant need of the colonizers' help. At the other extreme, once defined as dangerous terrorists, Palestinian children are expected to become the definition, thereby needing control and restraint, serving the dispossessive ideology of the state. When these children discuss topics which touch on human rights, their claims become ambivalent, and authorities position them as needing to be eliminated, evicted, or saved from their bad culture or bad parents. Positioning Palestinians as racially and ontologically inferior, and as one held captive in ever evolving zones of non existence, and in geopolitically invisible spaces of annihilation, where the world bears witness, yet turns a blind eye, are made possible by the definition of Palestinian children as born terrorists. I have spoken of this extensively elsewhere, but it bears reiterating the critical parameters of this phenomenon, that it is not only produced and reproduced in state cabinet meetings and global politics, but also staged and repeated in media outlets. What I am speaking of is state-sponsored terror on the terrorist other, the terrorist child. The so-called war on terror and its corresponding values allow the phenomenon of what I call unchilding to flourish despite the viciousness of violence and unending genocidal attacks, such as in Gaza in April 2018, as I write this conclusion. The targeted shooting of children, women, men, and journalists, and the mutilation and injury of thousands of Palestinians protesting in the return march in Gaza were defended in the words of military officer Zvika Pogel, who stated that anyone that threatens the border of Israel will be killed. When the reporter questioned the shooting of a 14-year-old child, he responded, anybody that threatens the border of Israel is sentenced to death. Producing the state's mandate to sentence children to death is an incremental genocidal unchilding. Even those children who were killed by mistake, such as the Bakr children mentioned in the previous chapter, were killed as Palestinians. There is no escape from that destiny. Constructed as terrorists, their deaths were presumed and expected in the racialized and violent death zone called Gaza. Current global politics, exacerbated by the ascendancy of the Trump administration in the United States and the security theology firmly entrenched in Israel's self-definition as a state, further weakens the just cause of Palestinian children and keeps them in a state of non-survivability and written out of the present, and thus out of any future history that these children might possibly write. Settler colonial ideology hopes that Palestinian children can be kept in spaces of incarceration, caged, as I have called it elsewhere in this book, and thus forever evicted. The universal logic of colonization requires the colonizers to continually produce newer and more refined technologies for further articulating and justifying the use of force, violence, and the wounding of children. As I have pointed out in this book, it is easier for the state to mark its power over children's bodies and lives. Emergency rules are often used to justify the imprisonment of the little terrorists and so keep them away from the influence of bad parents. The settlers constitute themselves as the only ones that can define and impose order, transfer power and rights. They dictate the limits, checks and balances, and impose the shared ethical standards, while keeping Palestinian children captive from the early years of the establishment of the state in 1948 to this day, in a spatio-temporal metaphysical zone of death. Called Small Snakes by Ayelet Shaked, the Minister of Justice in Israel, Palestinian children are being used as political targets while simultaneously considered outside the realm of any possible ethical politics. Through the fusing power of technology and religion and an invocation of quote unquote civilized and presumably civilizing capitalist modernity, Palestinian childhood is being all but erased. The sacred settler. As I have described in the section above, and simply put, unchilding is the authorized eviction of children from childhood. But as this book has revealed, within the settler colonial context, such eviction needs to be understood in terms of the trajectories of geographic desire, the psychology of the settler, and the history that mediates both. A foundational premise of unchilding, as I pointed out, is to create, transform, and construct children as dangerous others. The process creates an epistemology that continually reconfigures children, their bodies, the lands on which they live or are consigned to, and indeed the prospects of their very survival. At the core of this praxis is the centrality of race, a conflation of security as theology, and the hyper-colonial construction of the sacred settler. Racial violence is foundationally apparent in an unstated racial contract that marks Palestinian children as born terrorists, an appellation that often goes unchallenged, and which strips the children of every right within the structures of power. The Israeli racial contract, embedded in the inherent and inalienable Jewishness of the state, refuses to acknowledge that Palestinian children have any rights at all. The specific form of expropriation, expressed as this contract, justifies itself through an assertion that the settler is the authentic and original inhabitant and thus is merely reinstating that lost originality. They are the first among humans. Critical race theories have argued that, in order to execute the kind of fundamental rights advocated for above, the colonizers must first strip the racialized other, the presumed non-native, of their rights. Racial violence, as Da Silva defines it, is a strategy of power constituted through constructs of historical authenticity, which can never be verified but are nevertheless forever invoked from a structure and system of liminal beliefs. Ultimately, the racial logic of Israeli sovereignty constitutes the Palestinian child as a racially distinct unchild. The settler state deployment of racialized otherness is also founded in imperialism. As Edward Said has shown, these reconfigurations of otherness are there to reaffirm colonial geopolitical interests as the rightful owners of the land. But as I have attempted to illustrate throughout the book, land in this instance is not marked by verifiable and/or material boundaries, but rather takes on Orientalist colonial imaginaries. The purpose of Zionist ideology, substantiated by a correspondingly self-reflective code of laws and politics, is to justify continually shrinking the geography of the unchild until their available space is no more than the space of confinement. In short, as I have argued, a cage. Razak has explained, quote, "The space of difference to which Aboriginal people are confined in law and society is not then simply the space of exception where the law has authorized its own absence and established the state's monopoly on violence. It is a space where violence comes clothed in the language of improvement, a space through which the settler can come to know himself or herself as a legitimate owner of the land through his capacity to improve native others." Unquote. Similarly, Sunera Tobani has argued that a racialized logic of power that becomes deeply institutionalized is critical to the settler belief in sovereignty. As part of this logic, the other becomes devoid of rights and the legitimate sacrifice. Viewed from Tobani's perspective, Palestinian children, and by inference Palestinian childhood, are always already subjugated by the global colonial order wherein race is central to that order's constitution of sovereignty and the corresponding alien status of all others. The use of religious claims for the further sacralization of politics, medicine, law, and state criminality increases the speed of biopolitical degradation and makes possible the process of unchilding. Analysis of the Israeli settlers' racial politics and genocidal living-death policies, replete with eliminatory ideology, uncovers the settlers' need to produce the captive child and childhood as racially inferior, dangerous, and hence undeserving unchildren. Palestinian children and their captive childhood are a major site for the implementation of settler colonial ideology. Working together with the concept of the sacred settler is the global privileging of the Israeli narrative to security, life, and safety over any Palestinian rights to justice, or for that matter, even declarations of injustice. Scholars have repeatedly stressed how the political, physical, legal, and psychological management of the colonized Palestinian hides colonial political coercion aimed at normalizing Zionist dominance. That unchilding is undeniably affected by and the product of a global regime implicated by notions of the sacred settler. By connecting to the mythography of ostensible biblical history and the existence of the modern colonial state of Israel, everyone from political operatives, public experts, high tech firms, and major investors has rallied to support the policies of that state. Such global support further enhances the coming home narrative of Jews while allowing for the targeted eviction of the Palestinians. Whether this form of global support is tacit or explicit matters little and does not really challenge or change the material conditions and injustices under discussion. I do not think one need argue too strenuously that there has been a global shift toward the rise of a right leaning extremism that has exposed the concealed racism just below the skin of obviously authoritarian as well as ostensibly democratic states. In the contemporary Arab world, most regimes are undemocratic and do not represent the people in any operant way. The initiatives and policies of such regimes regarding the future of Palestine often reveal a lack of interest and contradictions that are ultimately harmful to the future generation of Palestinians. In the past 10 years, the Middle East has changed dramatically and drastically, and another major global player, Russia, is back in the region. A variety of continuing conflicts in the region has also produced large numbers of refugees in Europe, adding to and exacerbating existing racial tensions there. Cruelty and violence in Syria and the Wahhabi regime and their maneuverings have added to the collapse of Arab solidarity, which, among many other factors, has further strengthened the Israeli state, leaving Palestinians both fractured and vulnerable, and furthering the process of unchilding. If we add to this the failed experiment of the Palestinian Authority, both in Gaza and elsewhere, which only sustains Israel's occupation and colonialism, we realize that unchilding of the Palestinian child carries with it the political weight and baggage of all the regional conflicts. The racially inflected mediations of what constitutes a child and of who is a deserving child or not, combined with the racial redistribution of what childhood can mean conceptually, are a core component of my inquiry into the politics of unchilding. The global dynamics that contribute to the genocidal regime of unchilding places childhood at the center of the international dynamic of colonial governance. The process of unchilding, as I have been arguing throughout, delegitimizes Palestinian children while simultaneously rewriting the pathways for Jewish national control over not only Palestinian land and space, but also over the intimate spaces where children live, their homes, their schools, and even, as I have argued, their own bodies. Furthermore, the global politics of unchilding is fueled by political action and inaction, or policies and statements made by leaders and countries and also supported by arms production. Indeed, the flourishing of the arms industry and related military businesses are also mediated by field tested, combat proven politics that is often inseparable from the daily business of war in Israel. As the sale of arms has resulted in unaccountable profits for Israeli weapon manufacturers, it has also given rise to expertise in counterterrorism tactics and knowledge which the Israeli state then sells to others. Thus, the cycle of global support for the settler colonial practices of the state is now complete and internationally sanctioned. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and Israeli Defense Ministry data from 2013, Israel's weapon industry brought in brought in about 5.6 billion US dollars, making Israel the eighth largest weapons exporter globally. Israel has established itself as a leading weapons manufacturer, capitalizing on the need to maintain violence and instability, an issue that I will discuss further in this concluding chapter. Furthermore, 25% of the US military aid to Israel is spent on domestic Israeli arms manufacturers. Hence, as Alex Kane has explained, the US subsidy is helping to fuel the business of war. Israel's war, whether against Gaza or elsewhere, that have terrorized, injured, and killed children and destroyed their communities and demolished schools, homes, and livelihoods, are good business for Israel and its global supporters, as various scholars have explained. The racialization of security through combat-proven politics is furthered by the process of unchilding. The Israeli practice of spatial separation, the construction of physical and non-physical walls and military checkpoints to deny Palestinian children access to life, education, health, and movement, is being sold as military expertise. Israel's microsurveillance drone industry is also marketed as combat-proven and user-friendly. Relying on their field experience, military personnel retire from military service to find jobs working in defense technology where they can sell their expertise. Israeli companies sell weapons and acquired military expertise to countries that have committed genocide, such as to Serbia and to Rwanda, and to countries whose militaries have been accused of severe human rights abuses, such as Uganda and Nigeria. Israel currently sells arms to countries engaging in ethnic cleansing, such as Myanmar in 2017, resulting in the genocide of the Rohingya Muslim minority. Itai Mack, an Israeli lawyer who is trying to break the walls of secrecy around Israel's weapon exports, believes that fighting against such an industry can stop war crimes and crimes against humanity. In an interview with him for The Independent, Max stated that Israel is selling military expertise and weapons to Eritrea, Azerbaijan, Burkina Faso, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, Cameroon, Gabon, Chad, and other countries. 53 Israeli human rights activists submitted a petition to the Israeli Supreme Court demanding a criminal investigation of Israel's arms sales to Sudan. According to media reports, South Sudanese armed groups raped, castrated, and slit the throats of children. Any legal battles against Israel's defense industry and its securitized theology have only produced different modalities of surveillance and control that continue to compartmentalize Palestinian childhood, thereby constructing a geography of elimination. Speaking out against the construction of such geographies of dispossession, whether heard as moral outrage, condemnation, or at times reactive global panic when, for example, Israel attacks Gaza, has not hindered the necropolitical machinery of oppression or its allies. The brown-skinned Palestinian continues to be portrayed as a terrorist in the Western media, thereby triggering fear and a justification for the deployment of power against them. The attack on children and the exterminatory logic performed on Palestinian childhood requires at least some rethinking about the terrorist nature of the child used to sell arms as combat proven. In unpacking the global politics of unchilding, I hope to give voice to the complex relations of power that render Palestinian childhood unlivable. Standing at the juncture of criminology, anthropology, law, feminism, trauma studies, and my daily engagement with children who speak back against such globalized regimes of unchilding, I invoke the analyses of Jane Bennett in reconceptualizing relationships between global entities. Bennett discusses an ecological ethos, a concept that enhances our understanding of how things are connected together in a dense network of relations. Forensically, the questions are: what kinds of racial logic does Israel's colonialism, alongside its global allies, necessitate? How is the existing what kind of political ethos, network, colonialism assembled to maintain Palestinian unchilding against the securalism of the exceptional citizen, including the sacred settler? Intimate spaces, praxis, and penetrability. Unchilding, as I am reiterating here, is a comprehensive project that literally aims to colonize from conception to death. However, the viability of such praxis comes from its ability to penetrate the most intimate spaces of childhood. The scars created by the removal of children from the land are written on nothing less than the bodies of children. This wounding of the body occurs in the intimate living spaces of the children. In these spaces, the state's power registers more indelibly as children are stripped of childhood in the name of Israel's biblical rights and security. Abir, a 14-year-old schoolgirl, wrote in a letter to me, quote, "On October 27th, on my way to school, I noticed a Palestinian boy walking in the street. The soldiers stopped him, body searched him, hit him, and arrested him because he refused to take off his pants for their strip search. I challenge them when they touch me, but the way they carry their rifles is to make me feel they are about to shoot me or my classmates, and they shoot left and right and then accuse us. Every day we confront body searchers. We arrive at school late. We cross military checkpoints. They are after us in the street, at home, in bed, at school, even in the graveyard. Similarly, Niall, a 15-year-old schoolboy, wrote, I am a pupil, trying to build my future, but the walk to school is very humiliating. Every day I encounter body searchers. I have been stopped and arrested many times. The last time I was detained for 10 days. Every checkpoint has a large number of soldiers so they can harass us all. I arrive at school late every day. I am body searched many times a day. I live their racism and ridicule. I live insecurity. We can't go to places. We can't study, and we hear them calling us names to the degree that I started hating life. You leave home not sure whether you will make it back or end up Shahid, martyred. I added the emphasis to the last line of Abir's letter because her words uncannily reveal the political work of unchilding as a colonizing project that lasts from conception to death. Correspondingly, it is easy to mark the similarity of experiences spoken of in both their letters, the systemic evictions from the normal experiences of childhood through violations that are unending. To acknowledge these violations and the violence accompanying them requires us to concede that the times and spaces of Palestinian childhood are primarily structured by the racial logic of elimination. As I have been working on this book, the eliminatory operation of settler colonialism brought to my mind Foucault's description of biopolitics, how certain populations are considered disposable through an implicit or explicit state racism that is embedded in and structures the various regimes which comprise the totality of the state. The issue concerns who does and does not count as a subject and is thereby allowed corresponding legal and ontological agency. Sanctioning the life of one while dispossessing the other, is the racial logic of biopolitics. Of late, I could argue the operational logic we are speaking of here is no longer a local phenomenon, but has become a global one as states in the global community collude to do nothing to help children, even when the need is apparent and atrocities involve them. The biopolitics of what is happening to Palestinian children is similar to the prevailing European response to refugees. Laws must be found or manufactured to keep them out, even if their migration is hardly voluntary, but rather a matter of life or death, because the whiteness of Europe must be maintained at all costs. As Foucault's term implies, biopolitics implicates the very process of life, and as I also note in Abir's words above that living includes resistance. Quote, I challenge them when they touch me, she writes. From living in the region as well as my more formal scholarly research, I have witnessed the prevalence of that resistance. It is not isolated or localized. While some resistors become better known than others, or even accorded celebrity status due to the whims of Western media, the point and purpose of the resistance remains the same. Ahed Tamimi has become one such figure. Called the Palestinian firecracker in Western media, ostensibly on account of her reddish gold hair, Tamimi has recently come to the attention of the West because of the severity of her treatment and punishment. It should be noted that it is sanctioned by existing Israeli laws for slapping an Israeli soldier. The video of the incident has gone viral worldwide. It is interesting to note that when the Western media is critical of her, they invoke her parents for inciting her to an activist life, as they are activists themselves, as if parents are to be blamed if they teach their children about social justice. I do not know Tamimi or her family personally, but I can easily connect with the daily dispossession she experiences through state sanctioned racism. Tamimi, like many other Palestinian children, realized early on their status as the non living, dispensable other. I would venture to say that a young adult like Tamimi already recognized that she registers globally as non-life, uncounted. I think it is critical to note that Tamimi's slap, now exalted to celebrity status, is indeed both symbolic and material. as is her state-sanctioned unjust punishment. Within the operations of unchilding, the matrix of violence is hidden, justified through various theologies that are never admitted to. Interestingly, it might be too obvious to say ironically, the settler state that commits daily violence conflates the symbolic and the material of Tamimi's slap, a young girl against a fully armed Israeli soldier, as violence, utilizing the legal regime and the legal frameworks that is already in place. Abir and Niall's letters and Ahmed Tamimi's slap against the state, as well as the many voices and acts of children analyzed in this book, attest to the ongoing resistance. But more importantly, such collective opposition also suggests that the children already experience their bodies and lives at home, in the street, in school, in bed, or living on the land itself, as already marked and as political capital in the hands of those in power. The purpose of settler colonialism is to remove children from their land as much as they are removed from their childhood. My conceptualization of unchilding is intended to aid in understanding the necropolitical governance of native childhood. My intent in this discussion was to understand the efficacy of unchilding, to identify the reasons for its success. My studies reveal that unchilding operates profoundly through disruption of the intimate spaces of childhood to become inextricable within the colonial logic of eviction and elimination. The preoccupation of the settler with children is inherently tied to the colonial technology of power that is intimately aligned with the acquisition of land, and the more the colonizer has, the less is left for others, until there's only enough left for cages. As I hope I have demonstrated, land is intimately tied to the future of children from conception to death. Maintaining vulnerability. The data and the voices shared in this book reveal that the ways in which the settler state targets children are ever shifting and evolving. At different historical moments, Israeli policymakers have defined and mobilized various strategies, laws, weapons, and bureaucracies to continue the processes of dispossession I have thus far described. As this book makes apparent, the settler state's attack on children does not take place in just one continuum of space or time, but rather is strategically fragmented and plurivocal, with strategic narratives of space and historical moment and momentum being created as needed. Examples of this were in Lydda and Hebron, child arrest and home imprisonment, and the sudden declaration of villages as being unrecognized. The settler state marks the bodies and violates the intimate spaces, such as the schoolroom, the street where the children play, the home, the garden, the bedroom. The methods of marking are sometimes visible, physical, sexual. At other times, they are invisible, psychological. In time, the violence of the state becomes the pervasive narrative that defines time and space, so that the settler is even able to define and mediate the future in which no child is left untouched by its violence. The inability of children, parents, and the community more generally to predict the ways in which unchilding will occur, the time, place, intensity, and aggressive wounding, its fluidity and always changing nature, its mode and plurality of operation, or the policies that will mobilize such unchilding, attests to its brutality. Key to childhood politics and the targeting of children under settler colonial rule is not only the violation of children's rights through oppressive laws, discriminatory and inhuman arrests and abuses, and control of education, homes, and bodies. It is also the inscription of pain on childhood and the systemic preservation of social vulnerabilities against nurturing and the promotion of additional violations and racism. Here, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death assists me in addressing the maintenance of vulnerability as a critical aspect of the dispossession that I am trying to capture. The maintenance of vulnerability is embodied in the children's daily experiences. The logic of this violence, a violence that begins by calling and calling out Palestinian children, whether at home in the streets or even as they are in their mothers' wombs, as potential or actual terrorists, becomes a key component of the claim to sovereign power. The claim is manifested, as I have pointed out in this book and in my work elsewhere, in various ways. in the name of heightened security and or the biblical rights claimed by the state. This radical distraction from verifiable truths creates new forms of abject existence for the children. They become nobodies, non-humans, unchilded. At all costs, this vulnerability must be maintained, the state's power left intact so as to deprive them of food, suffocate and abuse them, demolish or militarize their homes, annihilate their future possibility, and kill them when necessary. The maintenance of vulnerability in historic Palestine in its various forms has been made visible in the various chapters of this book, and I have identified four modes of operational sets that are executed to achieve the aims of the settler state. The first is related to the social distribution of vulnerability in terms of location, time, age, gender, and mode, e.g., stripping of clothing, making people walk barefoot. This is also apparent in the deprivation of food, medicine, homes, and so on. In Palestine, the maintenance of a vulnerable childhood enables the state's logic of erasure, the elimination of a livable future for the generation to come. The second is related to the management of pain and suffering, which includes the mediation of any forms of intervention, global or local, internal or external, as either impossible, challenging, or always under the control of those in power, thus dictating who can be helped, when, and how. Third, the management of vulnerability maintains what Puar defines as the right to maim. Puar explains that maiming is intentional practice expands biopolitics beyond simply the question of right of death and power over life. Maiming becomes a primary vector through which biopolitical control is deployed in colonized space. Unquote. Maiming, she continues, functions as slow but simultaneously intensive death-making, as targeting to maim is an accelerated assault on both bodily and infrastructural fronts. Unquote. Responding to a regime that maintains its right to maim produces ongoing fear of injury and wounding. It creates a biopolitical space of wounding that keeps children as always already vulnerable entities, or as Puar insists, maiming masquerades as let live when in fact it acts as will not let die. Fourth, the production of vulnerability is also apparent in the denial and silencing of trauma and suffering. In her discussion of Palestinian suffering from the 1948 Nakba onwards, Rosemary Saih has theorized that the silencing of trauma locates different moments of pain. Quote, academic silencing is further exemplified by the exclusion of the Nakba from the trauma genre, a long line of studies focused on national catastrophes such as the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, and Hiroshima, as well as from genocide studies. Unquote. This racialized exclusion of Palestinian collective trauma, specifically of Palestinian children's trauma, maintains an unending suffering that marks children's psyches with an ontological sense of loss, of personal direction, the result of which is an imposed outlook of impossibility and hopelessness. Yet the children's voices continue to ask why the world cannot see their pain, why no one has been able to stop the injustices against them, why their collective trauma is ignored and silenced. But the regime that continually produces narratives about the Palestinian child is also constantly challenged by the children's own resistance and resilience. Therefore, Palestinian children are always and everywhere creating new spaces and temporalities using both peaceful and violent modalities. Such resistances are employed in order to insist on their right to childhood and their right to a dignified life and death, as attested in the words of Abira now presented earlier in this chapter. By listening to and invoking the children's voices, I recognize the settler's failure to keep the cage door firmly locked even in the midst of the most dreadful and painful conditions. Indeed, we have seen quite the opposite. A young girl in the film Janine demonstrates the power of children in the midst of destruction and loss. She says, I'm not afraid of cowards like them. I'm not afraid of them. They're like mice despite their great weapons. They have weapons and tanks, yet they scurry between their tanks because they fear us, mere civilians. They have weak willpower, and their fear is unnatural. It's akin to insanity. We're not afraid of them. In spite of everything they've done to us, we're not afraid of them. And when the filmmaker asks her why, with all the loss and destruction around her, she feels that she is stronger, she responded, I am stronger and can defeat them. I am stronger than Ariel Sharon, thanks to my will. I am stronger because I am defending my homeland. I am stronger because he murdered people whom I knew very well. I am stronger because he has dispersed us. He dismembered us and destroyed each corner in the camp. They killed my family, injured my people, demolished my house. Therefore, I am stronger. Unquote. The response of children to injustice insists on the justness of their cause and the morality underpinning their claims to right. The cruelty of violence and its racialized Orientalist practice of taking childhood captive in order to hinder children and their community from living life fails every time that a child resists, as reflected in the words of the young girl in Jenin Jenin. The counter narratives of the children themselves show how captive Palestinian children embrace their history and present right to resist the unending dispossession, whether in actual prisons such as in Lydda and Hebron, in open prisons such as occupied East Jerusalem and the Nakab, or in the open Zinzani that is Gaza. In fact, the ongoing injustice contributes to the maintenance of childhood experiences and memories as source of belonging, connectivity, continuity, and struggle, even during times of hopelessness, powerlessness, and pain. As Homi Bhabha reminds us in Nation and Narration, settler colonial violence is also a manifestation of a politico psychological condition whereby the colonizers are haunted by their fears. The unchilded are a daily reminder that the land, as well as the colonizers' time of presumed sovereignty, is stolen. Thus, their power is hollow. The colonial administration of childhood spaces, regulated by laws and heavily armed law enforcement personnel, are hyper reenactments of abstract, fantasy laden sexualized rape scenes, a pseudo physical penetration. One of the girls noted in a group discussion: the walk to school is tricky. I wish I could fly to school rather than walking between the soldiers. They harass us, they gaze at us. We can tell you stories of feeling the rifle on our behinds, heads, faces, even between our legs. Only yesterday, Hanan tripped because one of them pushed his rifle between her legs. On hearing this, a peer reacted in a loud, irritated voice. Just watch how they carry their rifles. Just watch how they stand facing us. I sincerely feel someone is probing my viscera. Baifujua bi ashai. The Zionist strategy of disruption and violence cannot ensure that they can call somebody else's stolen land home. The use of the terrorist label to describe Palestinian children allows for the racial securitization of childhood and incitement of further unchilding. Defining the Palestinian child through such modes of sacrificial violence politically opens a way for the settler to inscribe pain and trauma on the body and psyche of the child and its community. As Stoller taught us, in these tense and tender ties of empire, relations of power were knotted and tightened, loosened and cut, tangled and undone. These ties are not microcosms of empire, but its marrow. Unquote. The various modes of penetration, captivity, and incapacitation are developed carefully and in some instances slowly, but the national resistance is also developed against the machinery of dismemberment and genocidal uprooting. That disposition ingrains childhood defiance was clearly apparent during the First Intifada and continues to this day, as illustrated throughout this book. In their defiance, children are looking for something radically new that can be achieved, not through negotiation or political agreements like Oslo and other such imposed resolutions that suspend the revolution, but rather through a radical eruption that might bring change. Children's individualized experiences shaped a radical resistance, giving rise to their languages of opposition, confrontation, and heroism. Carcerality interrupted, against unchilding. I was walking in the old city and the scene was tense. Large numbers of border police, heavily armed soldiers, and obviously undercover security personnel filled the old city. I was walking, watching the movements of the security, their performed and practiced threatening presence in the streets of the old city, preventing Palestinians from walking specific paths, blocking their ability to reach some areas. Having been instructed to change my route and then doing so to reach the Damascus Gate, I heard the security guard shouting, "Stay inside," in Hebrew, and the voice of a woman shouting in Arabic, don't go out, they will shoot you." Suddenly, the small door behind her was forcefully pushed open, and the child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, rushed out, jumped on a skateboard, and started navigating his way to freedom between, among, and against the mass of security personnel occupying his space. The woman kept shouting, calling out to him, frustrated as she screamed at the security forces. "He's a child, just a child. This, my son, he wants to play. Let him play. I can't imprison him more. A child. You do not have children." Unquote. She started talking to me, speaking in a loud voice, I guess, asking me to help her explain to those security personnel invading the space in which her son just wanted to play. As I did so, she continued to call out to him, threatening to break his skateboard if he did not promptly return. The above account is a moment of what might be called carcerality interrupted. The act of a child pushing open the door of incarceration is an act of disobedience, given the space in which the everyday life is continually interrupted. Mahmoud's use of his skateboard, for him a mode of free play, so as to claim a momentary freedom even within his militarized neighborhood, is a moment that does become emblematic, even symbolic of life. Choosing at that moment not to heed the warning shouted out to him by his mother, Mahmoud continued moving, escaping his imprisonment and the imposed curfew, and perhaps in the knowledge that he would be soon captured, but desiring to interrupt his captivity anyway. His confidence, his fearlessness, even in the face of the knowledge that security and military personnel might shoot him at any moment, for he was violating a legal curfew, left us all in awe, but also terrified of the potential consequences. Even in the midst of my concerns, Mahmoud's play and his use of the skateboard seemed to me to create new boundaries for him. I could not help but think that his simple act of defiance was a clear challenge to those claiming sovereignty over his space. Even as I reveled in the boy's willful civil disobedience, I was simultaneously aware of all the possible consequences. I had witnessed such consequences far too many times. Mahmoud's mother, sister, and I tried to persuade the occupiers in Hebrew that he was just a child who wanted to play. The heat that day was oppressive, and in the interiors of the houses the air threatened suffocation. I suddenly felt as if we were navigating an unofficial and uncertain form of governance, as we did not know how convincing our pleas for permitting childhood would ultimately be. I wondered if we also wanted to receive recognition from the security personnel as we confronted the structures of domination they represented. Were we trying, in however limited a way, to abolish the imprisonment of childhood using Mahmoud's act of resistance as a catalyst? Our fears were soon answered when the soldiers and police forcefully pushed me and Mahmoud's mother to the wall, shouting that Mahmoud and his parents would be imprisoned if the boy did not immediately stop. Mahmoud's sister began to wail, asking him to come back before her parents ended up in jail. "Mahmoud, they will imprison mom and dad. Look, they caught mom. Mahmoud, come back." As Mahmoud looked back at his sister and mother, the skateboard hit the wall and he fell. Dejected, carrying a skateboard, he walked back to us in pain. Mahmoud was detained for more than 2 hours, held in detention in a small space between the army and police barricades. His mother, sister, and I sat on the side on the stone steps of their home in solidarity, waiting for the soldiers and police to release him, creating a counter checkpoint, a space packed with genuine concern, love, and support for the incarcerated unchild. Every few minutes, his mother reminded the police he's just a child, he wanted to play. The nearly 2 hours of waiting in our counter checkpoint of protection on the rough steps of the old city opened up a space for a long discussion and sharing between us. I remember us saying, "We can't keep counting their atrocities." Adding to our collection of stories of how we live and challenge each day. I knew that Mahmoud would not be recognized by the media as a casualty of state violence, and such willfully negligent record keeping goes back to the Nakba period. This uncounting made me realize that carcerality can be interrupted when we asked to be counted. The logic of accounting is crucial as Palestinian children's lives matter. The Black Lives Matter movement has reminded us what it means to be valued, what it means to be devalued, and subject to uncounted and unacknowledged violence. What we learn from Mahmoud and from his interruption of his lived captivity is that his life matters, his childhood matters, and his parents' role in his life matters. Opposing the politics of unchilding means that hard questions have to be asked by critically analyzing the narratives and data shared in this book. I hope we come to realize how children are portrayed by the settlers as inherently and structurally dangerous, and therefore require immobilization, captivity, neutralization, and more. The war is being fought over children's bodies. In attempting to think through the unchilding of Palestinian children, I argue that paying closer attention to the disciplining of children's body is deeply relevant to politics. In his Necropolitics, Achille Mbembe writes, war, after all, is as much a means of achieving sovereignty as a way of exercising the right to kill. Imagining politics as a form of war, we must ask what place is given to life, death, and the human body, in particular the wounded or slain body? How are they inscribed in the order of power? But Mahmoud's story makes us realize that the spaces of unchilding, the territories of abandonment, violence, poverty, demoralization, and uprooting, are so visceral and palpable that even children are able to point to them. Children themselves interrupt their carcerality, share their truths, and propose strategies that go beyond language and beyond location, engaging in a kind of decolonial love. Witnessing Mahmoud's nonconformity to his everyday captivity returns us back to the central question of this book. What does it mean to be an unchilded nobody that cannot play in its home space and that should always be captured, incapacitated, and controlled? Mahmoud told me that every day Israeli security forces block the area of his home and prevent him from buying sweets from the nearby grocery, from playing with his friends, from even sitting outside on the stairs of his house overlooking the streets of the old city. He explained how every day they harass him and his sister on their way to school, but after saying, I do not fear them, he paused for a minute and then said, what can they do? Kill me because I want to play, to live? Let them kill me. This is all they can do. Kill me. This is all they can do. And the news would say Mahmoud went down to play with a skateboard, he scared them, and they killed him. Final remarks on unchilding. In writing this book, I utilize a methodology that threads various voices, scenes, sites, temporalities, and geographies to embroider an account of Palestinian childhood experience. It was necessary to rely on multiscalar fragments as constellations of data to connect thoughts, records, and memories from various times and spaces and to note how history has marked the bodies of those whose lived experience I speak of here. I am aware that writing by use of a multiscalar methodology, one that brings together different threads, spaces, temporalities, and bodies, can be risky since the tale told may seem incomplete or broken. But it is from such multiscalar fragments that I attempted to use multiple points of data at different scales and periodic stages to describe the whole system of dispossession. I began the book with the recollected voices of children from 1948. Then I examined the politics of keeping children captive, followed by an examination of incarcerated and caged spaces in Hebron. From there, I looked at the penetration of the body and its sexuality and the demolished homes and homeland in the Nakab, the incarcerating and incarcerated home space in occupied East Jerusalem, and finally ventured into the open yet suffocating prison of Gaza. Through this embroidered methodology, I have addressed the complexities of children, childhood, and what I have defined as unchilding. Writing fragments that expose unchilding allowed me to speak of the visceral, political, geographical, and historical present. These multiscalar fragments also reveal an untold and ongoing story of racialized sovereign violence in the settler colony. Engaging with the unending atrocities against the child through this methodology brought about a disjointed unfolding in the face of violent excess. Developing a methodology that helps reveal the political work of wounding, evicting, and killing in the process of unchilding shows the integrally related dynamics of bodies, flesh, economies, technologies, laws, global and local politics, and more. Engaging in my own process of writing further opened my eyes to the way Palestinian children are permanently caged in the liminal zone of an unchilded childhood. The embroidered, interwoven methodology that I have employed extracts the threads of this narrative from the children I conversed with and learned from. They offered fragments of intimate, familial, traumatic, and national journeys, of survival which opened new possibilities for understanding the violence against them. And I came to understand that the point is not to come up with a coherent story, but rather to engage with previously unheard voices, with spaces and zones of inquiry which revealed how children became capital for dispossession. The study of childhood within a racialized regime necessitates a multiscalar methodology to grasp the structural embeddedness of global politics manifested in unchilding and to comprehend the way racialized carcerality of childhood operates. It is children who stress that the core principle of what I am calling unchilding is the criminalization of the Palestinian and the sacralization and privileging of the colonizer. Childhood, as I claim in this book, was and is a preoccupation of colonial and settler colonial authorities. Children's bodies become a primary capital of dispossession, and as such, childhood in the context of Palestine carries weight in Israel's racial policies and the claims for its needs for ever greater measures of security. As the various chapters of this book have demonstrated, unchilding the use of children as political capital for dispossession in the colony not only reveals the criminal intent of the settler state and its logical regional and global supporters, but also that it is inherently genocidal. My multiscalar methodology enables me to connect the disjointed accounts to reach those spaces, places, bodies once both dead and alive, paths, times, and contexts that describe a process of unending dismemberment and the regimes of removal, wounding, and captivity that operate in the spaces of the family. Historians who study domination, colonialism, and settler colonialism find that colonial authorities and oppressive regimes stage policies rooted in a false moral superiority that posit children as what I am calling political capital. Scholars of colonial histories teach us that the way children are raised, fed, schooled, and cared for shapes the mode in which colonial governance operates, produces political force, and maintains its exclusivity. Children and childhood are key sites for racialized dominance, imperial power and colonial control, colonial greed and dispossession. Invasion and occupation of nation states have ever been grounded in ideologies of imminent danger. The civilizing discourse embedded in the racial construct of demonizing the native justifies the utilization of every member of the violated community, including children, to serve the agenda of imperial, colonial, and racial powers. Western support for localized attacks against specific communities, such as the U.S. declaration that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, secures the reproduction and maintenance of what I have previously defined as security theology. Positioning colonized children as undeserving non-children, as human shields, as dangerous, always already terrorists, under the guise of racialized security necessity allows power holders to paint a confused space a less apparent atrocity, followed by civil and humane investigations to cleanse the attackers of any responsibility and so reproduce its civility. The political cultural framing of children as the enemy and thus as unworthy of protection has created racially constructed categories of the non human, including the non child, that are perpetually assigned a value of difference which is always liminal and always open to revision. While attacking and targeting children is unethical, immoral, and unacceptable according to global political treaties and mores, regimes of control have constructed a complex moral logic to justify harming children, including holding them captive, separating them from their families, depriving them of food and health care, and injuring and murdering them. This logic has enabled the politics and political work of unchilding to prolong rampant attacks on the bodies and livelihoods of children. It is the unchilding of Palestinian children that has created the regime of incarceration in zones of unliving and which has racially normalized the sentencing of Palestinian children to death. But it is with the everyday acts of children like Mahmoud that unchilding is interrupted.